A baby seal, trapped beneath the unforgiving Arctic ice, struggled desperately for breath as death closed in around it. With each passing minute, hope faded for the helpless pup. Then something massive cast a shadow overhead. A polar bear, the ocean's most feared predator, had caught the scent of vulnerable prey. What happened next defied all natural laws and left witnesses questioning everything they knew about these apex hunters. The Arctic winter had descended with brutal force, transforming the landscape into a glittering but merciless kingdom of ice. Temperatures plummeted to 60 below as howling winds sculpted the frozen sea into a maze of deadly beauty. The sun barely kissed the horizon before disappearing again, leaving the world in a perpetual blue twilight. Beneath this frozen wasteland, a baby harp seal found itself in a nightmare that no creature so young should ever face. The pup, barely 3 weeks old with its fluffy white coat just beginning to shed, had been hunting with its mother when disaster struck. They had been diving together through a labyrinth of underwater ice channels when a sudden shift in the current caused a massive ice plate to move. In an instant, mother and child were separated by an impenetrable wall of frozen seawater. The tiny seal, inexperienced and frightened, swam frantically until it found what looked like an escape route, only to discover too late that it had entered a pocket with no exit. Now, trapped beneath a thick sheet of ice that had sealed shut behind it, the seal frantically searched for an opening, any escape from its underwater prison. Its small body trembled with fear as it bumped against the crystal ceiling again and again, desperate to find a way back to the world of air and light. Each attempt grew more frenzied as the reality of its situation became clear. With each passing minute, raw panic set in. The seal's lungs burned for oxygen as it desperately pressed its nose against the ice ceiling, searching for pockets of precious air. Its tiny claws scratched helplessly against the unyielding barrier, leaving microscopic marks that told a story of growing desperation. The cold water, normally the seal's natural element, now seemed to be crushing it with icy pressure. Wildlife experts know that seals can hold their breath for up to 15 minutes during a normal dive. But this little one had already been trapped for 12, and terror was causing it to burn oxygen faster than normal. Its movements grew weaker, more erratic, as its small body began shutting down non-essential functions to preserve its failing heart. The desperate pup's once bright eyes began to dim as the cold and lack of oxygen took their toll. Its struggles became less coordinated, more like spasms than purposeful movement. The cruelty of nature was on full display. A young life about to be snuffed out, alone in the dark waters, with no witness to mark its passing. The seal's consciousness began to fade, its tiny heart struggling to pump oxygen-deprived blood. But just as hope seemed lost, something massive was approaching through the frozen wasteland. 1,000 pounds of pure predatory power moved silently across the ice. The polar bear's massive paws, each the size of a dinner plate, distributed her weight perfectly as she navigated the treacherous terrain. Her creamy white fur, nearly invisible against the snow, rippled over muscles honed by evolution into the Arctic's perfect killing machine. Steam rose from her nostrils in small clouds that dissipated quickly in the frigid air, the only betrayal of her otherwise phantom-like presence. She was hungry, desperately so. 3 days had passed since her last substantial meal, and the lean months of early spring meant every calorie was precious. Winter's grip was beginning to loosen, making the ice less stable and hunting more challenging with each passing day. With 2 cubs waiting in a den several miles away, her hunting success meant the difference between life and death for her family. The milk she produced for her young was rich with fat, but creating it drained her own reserves mercilessly. Biologists estimate a nursing polar bear can lose nearly 40% of her body weight while caring for cubs. A dangerous proposition in this unforgiving environment, where starvation is always one failed hunt away. The bear paused, her black nose twitching as she tested the air. Her sense of smell, among the keenest in the animal kingdom, could detect prey up to a mile away, even beneath thick ice. This remarkable ability allowed her to perceive a complex olfactory landscape invisible to humans, where each scent told a story of what lay hidden from view. Today, it had caught something promising. The distinctive scent of a young seal, its fear pheromones creating an unmistakable signature that triggered ancient hunting instincts in the bear's brain. Dropping to her belly, the bear crept forward with surprising stealth for such a large animal. The crystalline snow compressed silently beneath her, her movements so fluid they seemed almost choreographed. Her coal-black eyes, designed to cut through Arctic glare, scanned the ice field methodically. Years of hunting experience had taught her to read the frozen landscape like a map, identifying the subtle signs that betrayed prey beneath. A slightly darker patch of ice, microscopic bubbles trapped in a particular pattern, the almost imperceptible vibration of movement transmitted through the frozen surface. There, a barely perceptible movement under a translucent patch of ice about 20 yards ahead. The bear's ears pricked forward as she detected the faint sounds of distress, tiny vibrations carrying through the ice and into her sensitive paw pads. Her powerful heart quickened, pumping hot blood through her massive frame as ancient predatory circuits activated in her brain. This would not be a difficult hunt. The seal was already trapped, weakened, and would provide an easy meal with minimal energy expenditure. The perfect equation for survival in this harsh environment, where each calorie spent must yield more in return. Scientists who study polar bears know their hunting strategy is ruthlessly efficient. Unlike their brown bear cousins who evolved as omnivores, polar bears are hypercarnivores, specialized killing machines that derive more than 70% of their diet from meat. They locate breathing holes or thin ice where seals surface, then wait patiently for the perfect moment to strike, sometimes remaining motionless for hours. Or they smash through ice with powerful forepaws to reach prey beneath, the force of their blow capable of breaking through ice 8 inches thick. Either way, the outcome is almost always the same. The bear eats, or the bear grows weaker. There is no room for mercy in the brutal calculus of Arctic survival. No space for compassion when hunger gnaws and cubs wait. The massive predator approached the spot where the baby seal fought for its life, her movements now deliberate and focused. Her massive shoulder muscles bunched visibly under her thick fur as she lowered her head to the ice, confirming her target was just beneath. Through the translucent surface, she could make out the faint, darkened shape of the struggling seal, its movements growing more feeble by the second. Her powerful muscles tensed as she prepared to strike, claws extending slightly from their protective sheaths. In moments, those 5-inch daggers would shatter the ice barrier, and her powerful jaws, capable of crushing a seal's skull with a single bite, would close on their target. What the polar bear did next would defy everything we know about these fearsome predators. The polar bear raised one massive paw, poised to smash through the ice with devastating force. The trapped seal's fate seemed sealed in that frozen moment, another small drama in the endless cycle of Arctic predation. But then, something extraordinary happened. She hesitated. Her keen ears had detected a new sound, a deep, rhythmic vibration traveling through the ice, alien to the natural symphony of creaks, groans, and winds that compose the Arctic soundscape. The bear's head swiveled toward the source, her predatory focus momentarily broken. Her nostrils flared, sampling the air for unfamiliar scents carried on the bitter wind. Less than a half-mile away, a massive shape was moving across the frozen landscape, disrupting the pristine white expanse with mechanical precision. It was a human. Dr. Eliza Nordstrom had spent 15 years studying Arctic wildlife, her academic career dedicated to understanding the complex ecosystem that was rapidly transforming under the influence of a warming climate. But even she wasn't foolish enough to approach a hunting polar bear on foot, especially not a potentially hungry female who might have cubs. She sat at the controls of a specialized Arctic terrain vehicle, its caterpillar tracks distributing its weight across the fragile ice. The Norwegian researcher had been tracking this particular bear, known in her records as F217, for 3 seasons as part of a comprehensive climate impact study funded by the International Polar Research Consortium. Through high-powered binoculars that compensated for the challenging light conditions of Arctic spring, Eliza observed the bear's hunting behavior, expecting to document yet another example of the species' remarkable predatory efficiency. Her gloved fingers adjusted the focus slightly as she prepared to record notes on her tablet about kill technique and energy expenditure. Valuable data points in understanding how these apex predators were adapting to their rapidly changing habitat. What she saw instead left her momentarily speechless. The bear had backed away from her intended prey. Whether disturbed by the approaching vehicle or experiencing some unfathomable hesitation, F217 was now circling the spot where the seal remained trapped, showing signs of agitation rather than the focused killing intent of moments before. The bear's body language had transformed completely, her head swinging from side to side, her steps less certain, as if some internal calculation had suddenly yielded an unexpected result. Incredible, Eliza murmured into her recorder, her breath fogging in the sub-zero air inside the vehicle despite the heater's valiant efforts. F217 appears to be exhibiting atypical hunting interruption. Possible vehicle disturbance, though we're maintaining standard observation distance of 400 meters. Subject displaying unusual hesitation behavior, not previously documented in 3 seasons of observation. Time is 14:27 local. Temperature -38 Celsius, with moderate northeasterly wind. The researcher faced an ethical dilemma that was not covered in any of the extensive training manuals or scientific protocols she had memorized throughout her career. Scientific protocol dictated non-interference with natural predation events, a fundamental principle of wildlife observation that separated science from sentiment. Nature was harsh but balanced, and human intervention often caused more harm than good, disrupting ecological relationships that had evolved over millennia. Yet she could see through specialized thermal imaging equipment that the seal beneath the ice was still alive. Barely. Its heat signature was weakening by the minute, a digital representation of life ebbing away in real time. As a scientist, she knew she should simply document what happened next, recording it with the clinical detachment that had earned her respect among her peers. As a human being witnessing a life in peril, she felt a pull toward something else entirely, an emotion that had no place in scientific observation, but nonetheless tightened her chest and quickened her pulse. The rational and emotional parts of her brain waged a silent war behind her frost-reddened features. The bear made her decision first. Whether annoyed by the human presence or simply responding to some inscrutable urge born of ancient ursine wisdom, F217 suddenly turned and lumbered away. Abandoning her easy meal, her massive form moved with surprising grace across the ice, each step deliberate and powerful. She paused once to look back, as if contemplating returning to the hunt. then disappeared behind a pressure ridge. One of the many ice formations created when frozen sheets collided under tremendous pressure, creating miniature mountain ranges across the otherwise flat expanse. Eliza checked her watch, a specialized timepiece designed for Arctic conditions. If her calculations were correct, the seal had been underwater for nearly 14 minutes. Brain damage would begin soon, if it hadn't already. Death would follow shortly after. Even if the seal were somehow freed, the chances of survival after such oxygen deprivation were minimal. Nature had already rendered its verdict. She was merely witnessing the execution of the sentence. Science said, observe, record, do not interfere. This was the way of things in the natural world. Predator and prey, life and death. A delicate balance maintained over countless generations. Her interference could have unintended consequences. Perhaps F-217 needed this meal desperately. Perhaps the seal population needed this natural culling. Perhaps this was simply the way things were meant to be. Humanity said, act now, or witness death through inaction. The same consciousness that allowed her to conduct research, to understand ecological relationships, to appreciate the delicate balance of this frozen world, also burdened her with moral awareness. She alone in this vast landscape had the power to choose, to intervene, to change the outcome of this small drama playing out beneath the ice. The choice she made in the next 60 seconds would challenge everything she believed about her role in this frozen wilderness, forcing her to confront the uneasy boundary between scientific objectivity and human compassion. As the seconds ticked by, Eliza's hand hovered over the vehicle controls, her decision hanging in the balance as precariously as the life of the creature beneath the ice. Eliza's hand moved decisively to the controls of the Arctic terrain vehicle, her fingers gripping the cold metal as if it were a lifeline. The vehicle lurched forward, its treads grinding against the ice in a cacophony of sound that seemed to echo across the vast, frozen expanse. She navigated cautiously toward the trapped seal, knowing that this decision could alter the course of her research and, more importantly, the life of the young animal beneath the ice. Scientific objectivity warred with her conscience, but in this moment, the latter had emerged victorious, pulling her toward action. Decision to intervene recorded at 14:29 local time. She spoke into her recorder, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Subject F-217 has abandoned hunting, has abandoned sight. Trapped ringed seal showing minimal thermal signature. Intervention protocol initiated. As she approached the thin ice, Eliza gathered her emergency kit. A specialized ice pick, thermal blanket, and portable oxygen apparatus originally designed for human rescue. The equipment would now be repurposed for a purpose never intended by its manufacturers. She donned additional protective layers, knowing that the next few minutes would test both her resolve and her survival training, pushing her to the limits of her ethical boundaries. The ice groaned ominously beneath the vehicle as she stopped 10 meters from the seal's position. Any closer, and she risked breaking through herself. Polar bears could distribute their weight across thin ice, but her vehicle, despite its specialized design, was still far heavier per square inch. The last thing she needed was to become another casualty of the merciless Arctic environment. Approaching on foot with ice safety equipment, she continued documenting. Wind chill approximately -45 Celsius, visibility good. No sign of F-217 returning to sight. With each careful step, Eliza felt the weight of her decision bearing down on her. The crunch of the snow and ice beneath her boots was amplified in the stillness, each sound a reminder of the precariousness of her situation. The seal's faint movements were barely perceptible now through the translucent surface, and time was running out. She could feel her heart rate quickening, a primal response to the urgency of the moment. When she reached the spot, Eliza lay flat on her stomach, distributing her weight as she'd been trained. Through the cloudy ice, she could now clearly see the young ringed seal, no more than a few weeks old, its small flippers making increasingly feeble attempts to find purchase on the underside of its frozen prison. The creature's small dark eyes were wide with confusion and fear, a stark reminder of the stakes involved. "How did you get yourself into this mess, little one?" she whispered, though she knew the answer. Spring breakup created treacherous conditions for inexperienced seal pups. This one had likely become disoriented while learning to navigate between breathing holes and had somehow gotten trapped beneath a section with no access to air. The thought of its plight tightened her throat. Using the ice pick with careful precision, she began chipping away at the thinnest section, creating a small breathing hole first. The seal's instincts were still strong enough that it immediately sensed the opening, its small snout pressing upward for precious oxygen. She could see its desperation, and it ignited a fierce determination within her. "Breathing hole established at 1438, she recorded. "Subject responsive to air access. Condition deteriorating with each passing second." Now came the difficult part. The hole needed to be widened enough for extraction, without compromising the surrounding ice sheet that supported them, both. One miscalculation could send them both into the frigid water below. A death sentence in these conditions, especially with no immediate backup. The pressure was mounting, and Eliza could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on her. As Eliza worked methodically, her scientific mind couldn't help but note the irony. Here she was, a researcher dedicated to observing natural processes without interference, actively disrupting the most fundamental natural process of all: predation. What justified this exception? Why this seal on this day? How many others had she watched die during her career without intervention? The questions tumbled through her mind as the hole gradually widened. The seal's eyes, large, dark, and now fixed on her movements, seemed to hold no answers, only the simple, urgent desire to live that animated all creatures. It was a reflection of her own struggle, a reminder of the instinctual drive to survive that connected them both, despite their vast differences. Suddenly, a different sound reached her ears, the distinctive crunch of heavy paws on snow and ice. Her blood froze. Without turning, she knew what approached from behind. It was a sound she had heard too many times in her studies, a sound filled with primal power and intent. F-217 had returned. The polar bear stood just 30 meters away, her massive head lowered, black eyes fixed on the human who had interrupted her hunt. Eliza remained absolutely still, her heart hammering against the ice beneath her chest. Time seemed to stretch, the world narrowing to the tension between predator and researcher. The bear took another step forward, then stopped, assessing the strange intruder who dared to interfere with nature's design. In that moment, with a predator at her back and a dying seal beneath her hands, Dr. Eliza Nordstrom faced a fundamental truth about her place in this ancient ecosystem. She was neither observer nor savior, but simply another animal caught in nature's complex web, making choices that would ripple outward in ways she could never fully understand. The bear's nostrils flared as she inhaled the scent of the human, her instincts warring with curiosity and caution. Eliza could feel the tension in the air, a palpable energy that hung between them like a loaded bowstring, ready to snap at a moment's notice. The seal beneath her continued to struggle, its movements more frantic now, and Eliza knew she had to act quickly. With a deep breath, she returned her focus to the ice, her ice pick slicing through the remaining surface as she widened the hole. The bear remained still, watching, a silent sentinel in the frozen landscape, as if weighing the significance of the scene before her. Eliza could feel her heartbeat in her ears, a steady drum of urgency that spurred her on. Finally, the hole was wide enough. She could see the seal's small body now, its sleek form trembling with exhaustion and fear. In one swift motion, Eliza reached down, carefully grasping the seal's small flipper. She pulled gently, trying to avoid causing any additional distress. The seal responded instinctively, pushing upward with its remaining strength. "Come on, little one," she urged softly, her voice barely a whisper against the howling wind. With one final heave, the seal broke free from its icy prison, flopping onto the surface and gasping for air. It blinked up at her, its eyes wide and filled with a mix of confusion and gratitude. Eliza felt a rush of relief wash over her. But before she could celebrate, the bear took a step forward, her massive form looming larger as she assessed the situation. Eliza's heart raced as she realized the bear might not take kindly to the interruption of her natural cycle. This was a moment of reckoning, a point where the boundaries between human and animal blurred. What would F-217 do next? Would she accept the loss of her prey? Or would instinct drive her to reclaim what was rightfully hers? Caught between the seal's fragile life and the bear's primal hunger, Eliza understood the gravity of her actions. This was not just an act of compassion. It was a confrontation with nature itself, an exploration of the ethics that governed life in the wild. The next few seconds would not only determine the fate of the seal, but would also shape Eliza's understanding of her role within this intricate web of existence. Would she stand her ground? Or would she retreat, leaving nature to take its course? The decision loomed as large as the bear herself, and the weight of the moment felt heavier than the Arctic ice beneath her. Eliza held her breath, her body tensing as she waited for the bear's next move. Every muscle in her frame was coiled, ready to react, though she knew that any sudden movement could trigger an attack. The Arctic wind howled around her, carrying with it the scent of blood, fear, and the primal struggle for survival that defined this frozen world. Her lungs burned from the cold air, each breath a sharp reminder of the harsh environment that surrounded her. F-217 took another deliberate step forward, her massive paws leaving deep impressions in the snow that would remain long after this moment had passed. The bear's eyes never wavered from Eliza's face, studying her with an intelligence that belied the common assumption that animals operated purely on instinct. There was something almost contemplative in that gaze, something that suggested the bear was processing the situation in ways that extended beyond simple hunger or territorial aggression. It was as if the bear possessed a consciousness that mirrored Eliza's own, a capacity for reflection and judgment that transcended the typical predator-prey dynamic. "Easy, girl," Eliza whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. She kept her movements minimal, her hands still resting on the ice near where the seal had been moments before. "I'm not here to hurt you. I know you're hungry. I know this was your meal. I understand what I've taken from you." The words were pointless, of course. The bear couldn't understand English, couldn't comprehend the moral calculus that had driven Eliza to intervene in nature's ancient dance. The bear had no concept of human ethics or philosophy, no framework for understanding why a human would risk her own life to save prey that didn't belong to her species. And yet, something in her tone, something primal and honest, something that spoke to the fundamental struggle for existence that connected all living creatures, seemed to resonate across the species divide. The bear paused, her head tilting slightly, as if considering the human's words with genuine interest. Eliza's mind raced with the implications of what she was witnessing. In all her years of studying animal behavior, she had learned that bears were highly intelligent creatures, capable of complex reasoning and emotional responses. But this seemed to transcend even those remarkable capabilities. There was a quality to this moment that felt almost spiritual, almost as though two souls were communicating across a vast gulf of evolutionary distance. The seal, meanwhile, had regained enough strength to begin moving with greater urgency. Its small body squirmed across the ice, instinctively seeking the water that represented both danger and safety. A paradox of existence in the Arctic. Eliza watched as the young animal dragged itself toward the edge of the ice shelf, its flippers working frantically against the slippery surface, leaving a trail of moisture that glistened in the fading light. F-217's head swiveled to follow the seal's movement, her massive frame shifting slightly as if preparing to pounce. For a moment, Eliza's heart nearly stopped. She thought the bear would charge, abandoning her assessment of the human threat in favor of reclaiming her prey. Every instinct in Eliza screamed at her to move, to distract the bear, to do something to prevent the seal from being recaptured. But F-217 didn't charge. Instead, the massive predator simply watched as the seal slipped into the water and disappeared beneath the surface, swallowed by the dark depths that would carry it to safety, or to a slower death, depending on the severity of its injuries and the strength of its will to survive. The bear's body remained tense, her muscles coiled, but she made no move to pursue. When F-217's eyes returned to Eliza, something had shifted fundamentally. The predatory intensity had dimmed, replaced by something more complex. Resignation, perhaps, or acceptance. It was as if the bear had made a conscious decision to relinquish her claim on this particular meal, to acknowledge the human's intervention and to accept the loss that came with it. The bear stood motionless for a long moment, her massive frame silhouetted against the pale Arctic sky, her breath forming clouds of vapor in the frigid air. Then, with a sound that was almost like a sigh, a deep, rumbling exhalation that seemed to carry the weight of ages, she turned and walked away. Her powerful stride carried her back toward the pressure ridge from which she had emerged, her enormous paws crunching against the frozen surface with each step. She didn't look back, didn't pause or hesitate. She simply walked away, disappearing into the landscape as if she had never been there at all. Eliza remained frozen in place, unable to believe what had just transpired. In all her years of studying polar bears, in all the countless hours she had spent observing their behavior in the field and analyzing data in laboratories, she had never witnessed anything like this. The bear had had every opportunity to attack, to reclaim her interrupted meal, to defend her position as apex predator and assert her dominance over this human who dared to interfere with nature's ancient order. Instead, she had chosen to withdraw, to accept defeat with a grace that seemed almost noble. F-217 has retreated from the intervention site at 14:52 local time, Eliza recorded into her device, her voice trembling slightly with the weight of what she had just experienced. Subject displayed no aggression toward human or seal. Predator voluntarily abandoned prey recovery attempt. Behavior anomalous and unprecedented in observed patterns. Subject's withdrawal suggests possible recognition of human intent or acknowledgement of intervention. Further analysis required. She remained on the ice for several more minutes, watching the spot where the bear had disappeared, half expecting the massive animal to return. But F-217 did not come back. The Arctic seemed to exhale, the tension that had gripped the landscape dissipating like morning mist under the spring sun. The silence that settled over the frozen world felt different now. Not empty, but full of meaning, pregnant with the significance of what had just occurred. Finally, Eliza pushed herself to her feet, her muscles stiff from cold and adrenaline. She looked out at the water where the seal had disappeared, wondering if the young animal would survive its ordeal. The odds were not in its favor. Exposure, exhaustion, and the lingering effects of oxygen deprivation would take their toll. The seal's lungs had been deprived of oxygen for far too long, and even if it managed to reach deeper water where it might find food and shelter, the damage to its system might prove irreversible. But it had a chance now, a possibility that hadn't existed moments before. And in the Arctic, where survival was never guaranteed, a chance was sometimes all that mattered. As she walked back toward her vehicle, her boots crunching against the ice with each step, Eliza's mind raced with implications that challenged everything she thought she knew about animal behavior and the boundaries between species. What had she just witnessed? Was it possible that the bear had understood something about her intentions? That F-217 had recognized in Eliza's actions not a threat, but something else? A fellow creature struggling with the weight of survival in an unforgiving world? Could there exist some form of communication between predator and human that transcended language and evolutionary distance? The thought seemed absurd, and yet it lingered in her mind like a persistent echo, refusing to be dismissed as mere fancy or anthropomorphic projection. Back inside the vehicle, Eliza sat in the gathering twilight, reviewing her thermal imaging data from the encounter. The recordings would show what had happened: the bear's approach, her pause, her withdrawal. But they couldn't capture the essence of the moment. They couldn't convey the strange communion that had occurred between predator and researcher, the inexplicable choice the bear had made. Science could measure and quantify, but it couldn't fully explain the mystery of consciousness and intention that seemed to have passed between two creatures in that frozen moment. Her satellite phone buzzed with an incoming message, the electronic chirp jarring in the profound silence of the Arctic. It was from her research coordinator in Tromsø, a bustling port city far to the south, requesting an update on her fieldwork and asking about her timeline for returning to base camp. Eliza stared at the message for a long time before responding, her fingers hovering over the keyboard as she struggled to find words that could adequately convey her experience. How could she possibly explain what had happened? How could she describe an encounter that defied scientific explanation and challenged the very foundations of her understanding of animal behavior? How could she tell her colleagues that she had witnessed something that seemed to suggest a level of understanding and communication between species that had no precedent in the scientific literature? She began typing carefully. Field work proceeding as planned. Documented unusual predator behavior in subject F-217. Bear displayed unprecedented response to human intervention in active hunt. Subject retreated voluntarily without aggression. Behavior suggests possible cognitive recognition of human intent or emotional response to intervention situation. Will file detailed report upon return to base. Recommend expanded observation period to determine if behavior is anomalous or represents adaptive response to environmental pressures. Subject F-217. Showing signs of behavioral adaptation, possibly related to environmental stress factors and changing hunting conditions in warming Arctic. Recommend continued monitoring and expanded research parameters. The words were technically accurate, carefully worded to avoid making claims that would invite skepticism from her peers. But they felt hollow and inadequate. They didn't capture the truth of what had transpired out here on the ice. They didn't convey the moment when two creatures from different worlds had met at the intersection of life and death and had chosen, somehow, to let each other live. They didn't express the profound sense of connection and understanding that had passed between her and F-217 in those crucial moments. As darkness began to settle over the Arctic landscape, painting the sky in shades of deep blue and purple, Eliza made a decision that would alter the course of her research. She would stay at this location for the night, continuing to monitor the area with her thermal equipment and recording devices. She needed to understand what had happened. She needed to know if F-217 would return, if the bear would attempt to reclaim her interrupted hunt, or if something more profound had occurred. A moment of understanding that transcended the usual boundaries between human and animal. She prepared her camp with meticulous care, setting up her monitoring equipment and establishing a perimeter of safety measures. The vehicle would serve as her shelter, its insulation providing protection against the brutal cold that would intensify as the night deepened. She prepared hot food and strong coffee, knowing that she would need to remain alert throughout the long Arctic night. The night stretched before her, cold and vast and full of unanswered questions. But for the first time in her career, a career that had been defined by rigorous scientific methodology and careful observation, Eliza felt that she was on the verge of discovering something that no amount of scientific observation could fully explain. She was approaching the edge of something mysterious, something that challenged everything she thought she knew about the natural world and her place within it. She was beginning to understand that there were dimensions to animal consciousness and interspecies communication that existed beyond the reach of conventional science. Outside the vehicle, the Arctic night deepened, and somewhere in that frozen darkness, a polar bear walked alone, carrying with her the memory of a choice made, a choice that perhaps only she could understand. F-217 moved through the landscape with the grace and power that was her birthright, her massive form a silhouette against the starlit sky. She had made a decision that defied her instincts, that challenged the fundamental imperative to hunt and survive that had guided her species for millennia. What had driven her to make that choice? Was it recognition of kinship with another conscious being? Was it exhaustion or satiation from previous kills? Was it something else entirely? Some aspect of bear consciousness that humans had never fully appreciated or understood? These questions would haunt Eliza's research for years to come, driving her toward new methodologies and new ways of understanding the complex inner lives of the creatures she studied. The night deepened, and in the silence of the Arctic wilderness, two creatures, one human, one bear, carried forward the memory of an encounter that had changed them both in ways that neither could fully articulate or explain. Dawn broke over the Arctic with a pale, ethereal light that seemed to emanate from the ice itself, a luminescence that transformed the barren landscape into something almost otherworldly. The horizon was a thin line of fire where the sun struggled to rise, painting the underside of scattered clouds with hues of amber and rose that reflected off the crystalline surface below. Eliza had slept fitfully, her dreams filled with images of F-217's penetrating gaze and the desperate struggles of the rescued seal. Throughout the night, she had awakened repeatedly, her subconscious mind refusing to let go of the extraordinary encounter that had challenged everything she thought she knew about animal behavior and interspecies communication. She awoke fully to the soft, insistent beeping of her monitoring equipment, alerting her to movement in the vicinity of her vehicle. The sound pulled her instantly from the fog of semi-consciousness, adrenaline sharpening her senses and driving away the last vestiges of sleep. Pushing aside the thermal blanket that had cocooned her through the frigid night, she moved quickly to the console, her fingers flying over the controls as she activated the external cameras and thermal imaging system. The display flickered to life, bathing her face in a blue-white glow that accentuated the lines of concentration etched around her eyes. The screens revealed the vast expanse of ice stretching toward the horizon, a seemingly endless plain of white broken only by occasional pressure ridges and the dark shadow of open water in the distance. At first, she saw nothing unusual, just the endless white landscape that had become her second home over the years of her Arctic research. Then, a dark shape appeared at the edge of the frame, a moving silhouette that stood in stark contrast to the monochromatic background. F-217 had returned. The bear was standing approximately 50 meters from Eliza's position, her massive form unmistakable against the pristine backdrop. The early morning light caught in her thick fur, giving her a golden halo that emphasized her power and presence. She wasn't approaching the vehicle, wasn't displaying any signs of aggression or hunting behavior that Eliza had documented countless times in her research. She was simply watching. Her posture relaxed yet attentive, her head slightly raised as if testing the air for scents. F-217 has returned to the intervention site at 05:47 local time, Eliza recorded, her voice hushed despite being alone in the vehicle, as if speaking too loudly might somehow break the spell of this moment. Subject maintaining distance of approximately 50 meters. No aggressive posturing observed. Body language suggests curiosity rather than hunting intent. Behavior suggests possible territorial marking or continued interest in previous encounter site. This represents significant deviation from established behavioral patterns for this individual and species generally. Eliza's heart raced as she considered her options, the steady rhythm of her pulse echoing in her ears as she weighed the scientific imperative against the potential risk. Protocol dictated that she should maintain her position inside the vehicle, continuing observation without further intervention. The safety guidelines were clear and had been established for good reason. Polar bears were apex predators, capable of killing with terrifying efficiency, and no amount of unusual behavior justified placing herself in unnecessary danger. But something about this moment felt different, felt significant in a way that transcended standard research procedures. There was an opportunity here to document something unprecedented, to gather data that could potentially reshape scientific understanding of animal cognition and interspecies interaction. The bears returned to this specific location. Her calm demeanor, her apparent interest in the site of yesterday's encounter. All of these suggested a level of intentionality that warranted closer investigation. Making a decision that she knew might later be questioned by her peers and supervisors, Eliza donned her Arctic gear and prepared to exit the vehicle. She moved methodically, checking her emergency transponder and ensuring that her recording equipment was functioning properly. She verified that her satellite communication device was secure in her pocket, its emergency button within easy reach. If something went wrong, at least there would be documentation of what had occurred. Data that might contribute to scientific understanding, even if the cost was high. As she pushed open the door of the vehicle, the cold hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath despite her layers of protective clothing. The temperature had dropped further overnight, creating an environment so frigid that exposed skin would begin to freeze within minutes. The sun was just beginning to crest the horizon, casting long shadows across the ice and bathing the scene in a golden light that belied the brutal temperature that threatened any living thing foolish enough to venture unprepared into this beautiful but lethal wilderness. F-217 remained motionless, watching as Eliza carefully descended from the vehicle and stood on the ice. The bear's breath formed clouds of vapor in the frigid air, billowing around her massive head like the steam from some primordial creature. Her eyes, dark and intelligent, remained fixed on the human figure. But otherwise, she showed no reaction to Eliza's appearance. There was no raising of hackles, no pawing at the ground, none of the typical warning signs that would indicate stress or aggression. "I'm maintaining visual contact with subject F217, Eliza spoke into her recorder, her voice steady despite the mixture of fear and excitement coursing through her veins. "Bear is exhibiting unusual behavior, remaining stationary despite human presence. No signs of distress or aggression. Subject appears to be deliberately maintaining current position, possibly to observe human activity or to communicate territorial boundaries. This represents significant deviation from previously documented behavior patterns for this individual." Slowly, with deliberate movements that telegraphed her intentions, Eliza began to walk toward her equipment case, which was secured to the exterior of the vehicle and contained her high-powered telephoto lens and additional recording equipment. She wanted to document this encounter in as much detail as possible, to capture every nuance of F217's behavior for later analysis. The scientific community would demand extraordinary evidence for the extraordinary claims that might emerge from this encounter. And Eliza was determined to provide that evidence in irrefutable detail. The bear watched, her dark eyes tracking Eliza's movements with what seemed like curiosity rather than predatory intent. There was something almost contemplative in her gaze, as if she were trying to understand this strange two-legged creature who had interrupted her hunt the previous day. The massive head tilted slightly, an expression that, in a human, might have indicated puzzlement or consideration. Eliza had spent years learning to read the subtle body language of these magnificent predators, and everything she observed now suggested that F217 was engaged in assessment rather than preparation for attack. Eliza reached the equipment case and carefully extracted the camera, her fingers clumsy with cold despite her insulated gloves. The familiar weight of the professional-grade equipment was reassuring in her hands, a connection to the scientific methodology that had guided her career. She raised the lens, focusing on F217's face, adjusting the settings to capture the bear's expression in exquisite detail. The camera's motor drive whirred softly as it captured a series of high-resolution images, documenting this extraordinary moment for posterity. What she saw through the viewfinder took her breath away. The magnification brought F217's features into sharp relief, revealing nuances that weren't visible to the naked eye. There was an intelligence in those eyes that went beyond mere animal awareness, beyond the instinctual responses that drove survival in this harsh environment. There was a presence, a consciousness that seemed to reach across the divide between species and touch something fundamental in Eliza's own understanding of the world. It was as if the bear was looking not just at her, but into her, recognizing her as a fellow sentient being rather than merely as a potential threat or irrelevant element in the landscape. For several minutes, human and bear regarded each other across the ice, neither moving, neither breaking the strange communion that had developed between them. The only sounds were the whisper of the wind across the ice and the occasional click of the camera as Eliza continued to document the encounter, her scientific mind working overtime to process what she was witnessing. This wasn't just unusual behavior. This was something that challenged the very foundations of how humans understood animal cognition and interspecies interaction. "Subject maintaining eye contact," she recorded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Posture remains relaxed. Ears forward. No signs of stress or aggression. Pupillary response and facial microexpressions suggest active processing rather than instinctual reaction. Behavior consistent with cognitive assessment rather than predatory or defensive positioning." Then, as suddenly as she had appeared, F217 turned and began to walk away, her powerful form moving with surprising grace across the frozen landscape. Each step was deliberate, Unhurried, the massive paws spreading wide to distribute her weight across the ice. She didn't look back, didn't hesitate or display any of the vigilance behaviors that would suggest concern about a potential threat behind her. She simply continued on her journey, her dark silhouette growing smaller against the white expanse until she disappeared into the distance. As the morning light strengthened, swallowed by the vastness of the Arctic wilderness. Eliza remained where she stood, the camera still raised, her heart pounding with the significance of what had just occurred. This wasn't just an unusual animal behavior to be documented and analyzed within existing frameworks of understanding. This was something more profound, something that challenged her understanding of consciousness and connection in the natural world. What she had witnessed suggested a level of intentionality and recognition that went beyond what current scientific consensus acknowledged was possible in non-human animals. Back inside the vehicle, her fingers still tingling as circulation returned to extremities that had begun to numb in the brutal cold, she began the process of downloading the images and video she had captured. The high-resolution files transferred slowly to her research computer, each image revealing details that further reinforced her growing conviction that something extraordinary had occurred. F217's eyes, captured in perfect clarity by her telephoto lens, showed a depth and awareness that seemed impossible to dismiss as merely instinctual. The sequence of the bear's movements, her deliberate approach and equally deliberate departure, suggested purpose rather than random wandering or opportunistic hunting behavior. Eliza's mind raced with possibilities as she reviewed the data. What if there was more to animal consciousness than humans had previously recognized? What if the boundaries between species were more permeable, more fluid than science had acknowledged? What if creatures like F217 possessed the forms of intelligence and awareness that humans had failed to recognize simply because they manifested differently than human consciousness? The implications were staggering, not just for biology and ethology, but for philosophy, ethics, and humanity's understanding of its place in the natural world. Her satellite phone chirped, breaking her concentration. The harsh electronic sound seemed jarringly out of place in the wake of the profound connection she had just experienced. It was a message from the research station, the text appearing on the small screen with an urgency denoted by its red highlighting. Urgent. Severe storm system approaching your position. Estimated arrival 18 hours. Barometric pressure dropping rapidly. Wind speeds expected to exceed 100 km/h. Temperatures to drop below 40 degrees. Immediate evacuation recommended. Acknowledge receipt and confirm evacuation plan. Eliza stared at the message, feeling the weight of conflicting priorities pressing down on her. Safety demanded that she heed the warning and begin preparations for evacuation immediately. Arctic storms were notoriously dangerous, capable of trapping researchers in conditions that could prove fatal within hours. The research station's meteorologists were among the best in the world, their predictions rarely wrong when it came to severe weather events. Ignoring their warning would be not just foolhardy, but potentially suicidal. But scientific curiosity, and something deeper, something more personal, urged her to remain, to continue observing, to try to understand the connection that seemed to be developing between her and F217. What if the bear returned again? What if there was an opportunity to document further interactions that could revolutionize understanding of animal cognition? What if leaving now meant missing a breakthrough that might never be repeated? As she contemplated her options, her gaze fell on the data display showing F217's movements over the past 24 hours, tracked via the GPS collar that had been placed on the bear during a previous research expedition. The visualization showed that the bear had traveled in a wide circle after leaving the intervention site yesterday, covering nearly 15 kilometers of territory before eventually returning to the same spot where the encounter had occurred. This wasn't random movement dictated by the opportunistic search for food. This was deliberate, purposeful behavior that suggested intention and memory, cognitive capabilities that went beyond what most researchers attributed to even the most intelligent non-human predators. Acknowledging receipt of storm warning, she typed into her satellite communicator, her decision forming even as her fingers moved across the keys. Beginning evacuation preparations. Will provide departure confirmation within 2 hours. The message bought her time. Not much, but enough to complete her documentation of this extraordinary encounter, to organize her data and ensure that nothing would be lost if the storm arrived earlier than predicted. She turned back to her equipment, determined to extract every possible insight from the data she had gathered, to prepare a preliminary analysis that would withstand the scrutiny that would inevitably follow when she presented her findings to the scientific community. As she worked, meticulously cataloging images and recordings, adding detailed notes to her observations, Eliza couldn't shake the feeling that what had happened between her and F-217 represented something significant, not just for her research, but for human understanding of the natural world. In that silent exchange across the ice, something had passed between them, something that transcended language and species, something that spoke to the fundamental connection between all living beings. It was a connection that challenged the anthropocentric view that had dominated scientific thought for centuries, suggesting instead a continuity of consciousness that extended throughout the animal kingdom, manifesting in different forms but sharing essential qualities across species boundaries. The storm was coming, and soon she would have to leave this place, returning to the world of academic discourse and scientific skepticism. She would face questions and doubts, would need to defend her observations against colleagues who would seek more conventional explanations for F-217's behavior. There would be accusations of anthropomorphism, suggestions that she had projected human qualities onto an animal acting purely on instinct. The path ahead would not be easy, but she would carry with her the memory of those moments on the ice, and the knowledge that there were depths to animal consciousness that science had only begun to explore. The images she had captured, the data she had collected, these would form the foundation of a new direction in her research, a quest to understand the inner lives of creatures that had for too long been viewed as operating purely on instinct rather than through forms of consciousness that might be different from, but no less complex than, human awareness. Outside, the Arctic wind began to strengthen, carrying with it the first hints of the approaching storm. The sky to the west was darkening, the clear blue giving way to a band of gray that signaled the advancing weather system. Time was running short, the window for safe evacuation narrowing with each passing hour. Eliza increased her pace, finalizing her documentation and beginning the process of securing her equipment for transport. But for now, in this moment, as she prepared to leave this place of profound encounter, Eliza felt a deep sense of peace and purpose that transcended the immediate concerns of weather and evacuation. She had witnessed something extraordinary, something that would change the course of her research and perhaps, in some small way, humanity's understanding of its place in the natural world. The data she carried with her represented not just scientific observations, but a potential paradigm shift in how humans understood their relationship with other conscious beings that shared this planet. And somewhere out on the ice, a polar bear continued her solitary journey, moving through a landscape that grew increasingly hostile as the storm approached. F-217 would face the coming tempest with the resilience and adaptation that had allowed her species to survive in one of Earth's most unforgiving environments. Her massive body designed by evolution to withstand conditions that would kill a human in hours. She carried with her memories of an encounter that had defied the ancient boundaries between predator and prey, between observer and observed, between human and animal. In that shared moment of recognition and restraint, something new had been born. A bridge across the divide that separated two species. A connection that spoke to possibilities that neither science nor philosophy had fully imagined. The data continued to flow across Eliza's screen, numbers and images that would form the basis of her research for years to come. But beyond the data, beyond the scientific analysis, lay a truth that she was only beginning to comprehend. A truth about consciousness and connection that would challenge everything she thought she knew about the natural world and her place within it. It was a truth that would not easily be captured in research papers or conference presentations. A truth that spoke to something more fundamental than scientific categorization or taxonomic classification. As she completed her preparations for evacuation, securing the last of her equipment and initiating the vehicle's startup sequence, Eliza paused for a moment, looking out across the vast expanse of ice where F-217 had disappeared. The horizon was empty now, the bear long gone, but the memory of their encounter remained vivid, a moment of connection that had transcended the boundaries of species and opened a window into possibilities that science was only beginning to explore. End of observation period at Site Alpha 217, she recorded, bringing formal closure to this phase of her research. Evacuating due to approaching storm system. Preliminary analysis suggests significant behavioral anomalies in subject F-217, indicating possible advanced cognitive processing and intentional communication. Full analysis to follow upon return to research station. The words were professional, detached, appropriate for a scientific record, but they couldn't capture the profound sense of wonder and possibility that had taken root in Eliza's consciousness. A seed that would grow and flourish in the years to come, changing not just her research, but her understanding of what it meant to share this planet with other beings whose inner lives might be richer and more complex than humans had ever imagined. The vehicle's engine roared to life, a mechanical intrusion in the pristine silence of the Arctic. As Eliza began her journey back to the research station, navigating carefully across the ice that would soon be swept by winds of hurricane force, she carried with her not just data and images, but a new vision of the natural world. A vision of connection rather than separation, continuity rather than hierarchy, of consciousness that flowed through all living things in different forms, but with a shared essence that bound all creatures together in the great web of existence. The storm was coming, but Eliza moved toward it with a sense of purpose and clarity that transcended fear. She had glimpsed something profound in the eyes of F-217, something that would guide her research and her life in new directions. Whatever challenges lay ahead, academic skepticism, the rigors of scientific verification, the practical difficulties of studying consciousness across species boundaries, she would face them with the strength that comes from having glimpsed a truth too significant to ignore. And somewhere in the vast wilderness of the Arctic, a polar bear named F-217 continued her ancient dance of survival, carrying within her a memory of connection that defied explanation, but existed nonetheless, a moment of recognition across the vast gulf that separated her species from humanity. In that moment, something had changed, something subtle but profound, a shift in the relationship between two beings that represented perhaps the first tentative step toward a new understanding of consciousness and connection in the natural world. The wind continued to rise, the storm drawing ever closer. But beneath the surface of observable phenomena, beneath the physical realities of weather and ice and survival, a new possibility had emerged. A possibility of understanding and connection that transcended the limitations of species and spoke to the fundamental unity of all living things. It was a possibility that would shape Eliza's research and her life in the years to come, guiding her toward discoveries that would challenge humanity's understanding of its place in the natural world and its relationship with the other conscious beings with whom it shared this planet.